In the early 1800s, a young woman was taken from the southern tip of Africa and paraded across Europe, not as a guest, but as an exhibit. Her name was Sarah Bartman, and what happened to her would leave scars that stretched across continents and generations. They called her many things, few of them kind, and the world looked on in fascination while her dignity was stripped away piece by piece. Her story isn't one you'll often find in history textbooks, yet it reveals more about colonial cruelty, scientific racism, and human exploitation than most lessons dare to explore. What they did to her body was disturbing. What they did to her memory was worse. This is the story they never wanted told. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, consider subscribing to the channel. We'd be grateful for your support. Let's dive into it. Sarah Bartman was born in 1789 near the Gamtoos River in what is now South Africa's Eastern Cape. She belonged to the Gonakwa people, a subgroup of the Khoikhoi. The Khoikhoi had lived in the region for centuries as pastoralists, herding cattle and sheep across the semi-arid plains of southern Africa. But by the time Sarah was born, their way of life was already under assault. Dutch colonial settlers had moved steadily inland from the Cape Coast since the 17th century, bringing with them diseases, land seizures, and a labor system that disrupted local communities. The British, having taken control of the Cape from the Dutch in the early 19th century, continued this trend. The frontier was no longer just a contested space. It had become a site of permanent loss. Sarah's family experienced this collapse firsthand. Her mother died when Sarah was still a toddler. Her father, a cattle herder like many in their community, died not long after. She was raised in an environment shaped by grief, survival, and the erosion of autonomy. As a teenager, Sarah married a fellow Khoikhoi named Pienaar, a drummer who worked for colonial militias. Their union brought a brief period of personal stability, but it was short-lived. The couple's infant child died in early childhood. Soon after, Pienaar himself was killed by a settler. It was a brutal act in a region where such violence had become increasingly common, as white colonists clashed with and often targeted indigenous populations. By the time Sarah reached her late teens, she had lost nearly every anchor of security in her life. That was when she came under the control of a settler named Peter Willem Keizer. Keizer was a farmer from a colonial family with roots in the Dutch settler class. He either purchased Sarah outright or seized her under coercive legal structures that blurred the lines between slavery and indenture. By the end of the 18th century, Khoikhoi laborers were often classified as free, but were effectively bound to farms through debt or obligation. Sarah was taken to Cape Town and placed in the household of Peter's brother, Hendrik Keizer. Cape Town in the early 1800s was a city built around trade and hierarchy. It sat at the strategic tip of Africa, an essential port for ships traveling between Europe and the East Indies. The town bustled with merchants, sailors, soldiers, and settlers from across the colonial world. But beneath its commercial facade was a rigid racial order. White Europeans held power, while black and indigenous people worked as laborers, servants, and, in many cases, slaves. Sarah lived in this world as a domestic servant in Hendrik Keizer's home, her daily life shaped by the rules of colonial discipline and racialized control. Sarah's appearance set her apart in a city where whiteness was valued above all else. She had the pronounced physical features common among Khoikhoi women, including steatopedia, a condition marked by the accumulation of fat around the buttocks. In Khoikhoi society, this was neither unusual nor mocked, but among European settlers and visitors, it provoked fascination, derision, and racial theorizing. It was through this distorted lens that Sarah began to be seen, not as a person, but as a specimen, a body that could be commodified and displayed. She was called Saartjie, a diminutive form of Sarah in Dutch. The name, like many details in her story, was imposed on her. She was also given other nicknames, most of them demeaning. Observers in Cape Town treated her as an exotic curiosity. Stories about her physique spread among colonial circles. One man, William Dunlop, saw an opportunity. A British Army surgeon stationed in the Cape, Dunlop had fallen into financial difficulty and believed he could exploit Sarah's image for profit. He proposed a venture with Hendrik Caesar, take Sara to Europe and exhibit her for paying audiences. On 29 October 1810, Sara signed a contract that sealed her fate. It was written in Dutch and English, languages she could not read. She came from an oral tradition, like most Khoikhoi at the time, and there is no evidence she fully understood the document's terms. The contract labeled her an indentured servant and stated that she would travel to England and Ireland, perform in exhibitions, receive a share of the profits, and return to South Africa after 5 years. But the men involved had no intention of honoring those promises. They were desperate for money and intended to use Sara as a commercial attraction. Her consent, if it could even be called that, was obtained under deeply unequal and deceptive circumstances. Within days, she boarded a ship to London. It was her first voyage across the ocean. She left behind the land of her birth, the last remnants of family, and the graves of her husband and child. Her language, her culture, and her community were gone. Ahead lay a continent that saw her body as alien and her presence as an opportunity for exploitation. Sarah Bartman did not travel to Europe as a free woman in search of opportunity. She was taken as cargo in a scheme born of desperation and colonial greed. Every step of her journey, from the Gamtoos River to the streets of Cape Town to the docks of London, was shaped by systems that sought to erase her voice and commodify her form. The woman who arrived in England was already carrying the weight of profound personal loss and cultural displacement. That weight would only grow heavier in the years to come. When Sarah Bartman arrived in London late in 1810, she was barely 21 years old, far from home, language, and support. In London, she was thrust into a world of crowds, lights, and strangers. Under the stage name, the Hottentot Venus, a racist epithet combining the slur, Hottentot, with the name of the Roman goddess of love, she became a spectacle in a traveling show. Advertisements in newspapers and posters invited curious Londoners to come and see the Hottentot Venus for a small fee. Sara was dressed in a tight flesh-colored costume meant to simulate nudity, leaving little to the imagination. On stage, she had to stand and display her body in front of audiences who paid to stare at her famously large behind and other so-called oddities. Some patrons even reached out to touch and poke her, as if she were an animal on exhibit. Every night she was made the center of perverse curiosity. The London public was fascinated by Sara. Newspapers of the day described her in sensationalist terms, comparing her to beasts and monsters. Entertainers marketed her as a missing link between man and beast, feeding into crude racial theories that viewed Africans as subhuman. Among the crowd were those motivated by racism and lust. They ogled Sara on stage, and some even reached under her garments to feel her body. The humiliation was extreme. She wore a costume that gave the illusion of being naked while strangers gawked, illustrating a painful double standard of that era. Her name became associated with the early 19th century fashion of the bustle, as Western women padded their dresses to emulate her figure. Around her jaws an Hottentot apron, and about her body exotic textiles served only to heighten this crude display. Sara received only a meager portion of the money she generated. The promoters, Dunlop and the Caesars, kept the profits. Amid this exploitation, some British abolitionists intervened. In 1810, a group of sympathizers filed a lawsuit on Sara's behalf to stop the exhibitions. They argued that although slavery was technically illegal in Britain, Sara was being held like a prisoner in the shows. In court, Sara was brought in to testify. Though she did not even speak English well, she was coached to say she was not being mistreated. Hendrik Caesar presented the contract Sara had signed, and the judge ruled against the abolitionists. Sara's indenture was deemed legal, and the show was allowed to continue. Sara's fate was sealed. In the months that followed, her notoriety only grew. The trial brought media attention that strangely made her even more famous. Promoters booked tours for her across Britain and Ireland. She performed not just in London, but as far afield as Dublin and Belfast by 1812. Throughout these years, Sara endured unimaginable distress. She was alone in a foreign land, clinging to a promise of return that was never kept. Historians note that each night she confronted crowds hungry to mock or gawk at her. Dr. Pamela Scully points out that Sara's situation in London resembled urban slavery. She had no freedom, and her well-being was dictated entirely by others. Scholars suggest she must have felt despair and humiliation every night. She was expected to perform on stage, but never allowed to behave as an ordinary human being. And though British abolitionists had won emancipation for slaves in the early 19th century, Sara's experience lay outside the law. In effect, she became one of London's most famous sideshow attractions, treated like a circus animal more than a person. Yet through it all, she remained powerless to stop it. In late 1814, Sarah Bartman's tour moved to mainland Europe. After 4 years of being exhibited in Britain, she was taken to Paris in September during the political unrest that followed the fall of Napoleon's empire. Once in France, Hendrik César sold Sara to a showman named S. Rayo, who had built his reputation exhibiting exotic animals. With her transfer to this new owner, Sara's exploitation entered an even darker stage. Rayo quickly recognized Sara's commercial value and placed her on display in the bustling city of Paris. Public exhibitions took place at venues like the Palais Royal, a cultural and commercial hub. Posters advertised her as an object of fascination. Large crowds paid to witness what they were told was a rare physical anomaly, feeding a voyeuristic obsession that dehumanized her. In contrast to London, the exhibitions in Paris became more aggressive and more intimate. Rayo allowed members of the public, especially wealthy clientele, to touch Sara during private viewings. These performances were less theatrical and more predatory, often hosted in salons and exclusive gatherings. Accounts from the period describe how Sara was displayed like a centerpiece during aristocratic dinners, where her appearance was orchestrated as a form of after-dinner entertainment. Attendees would drink and feast, then be invited to examine her body. She was made to walk, turn, and stand still as guests evaluated her with scientific detachment or sexual curiosity. The idea that she was simply part of the show became justification for the way she was used. Her humanity was removed from the equation. The conditions worsened. Rayo, who had previously specialized in animal exhibitions, treated Sara no differently than the rhinoceroses or monkeys in his charge. He would bring her out in a cage alongside animals and give her performance cues, commanding her to pose for the crowd. Some of these displays were held in public halls. Others were private spectacles where Sara was forced to endure not just humiliation, but also abuse. Some observers noted that she often tried to cover herself with a small cloth or apron out of modesty and cultural respect. That was not allowed for her comfort, but rather begrudgingly permitted because Sara refused to perform otherwise. Rayo, according to multiple sources, preferred to show her completely nude, but adjusted only to avoid scandal or interference. Sara's presence in Paris also drew the attention of the French scientific community. Leading naturalists and anatomists saw her as a unique opportunity to support their race-based theories about human difference. Scientists visited her shows to observe her physique and later argued that her features represented a biological link between humans and animals. This racist pseudoscience fed into popular publications and lectures that depicted African people as inferior. Sara's body, without her consent, was used to validate theories that positioned black people as closer to primates than to white Europeans. Her identity and her origin story were twisted to serve this agenda. As the months passed, Sara's physical and emotional health declined rapidly. She was malnourished, emotionally drained, and overworked. By the end of 1815, her body began to break down. She had been in Europe for 5 years, passed between showmen, and pushed into an unrelenting schedule of performances and private displays. Her deteriorating health was visible to many, though her handlers continued to present her for as long as she could stand. In December of that year, she fell severely ill and was taken to a hospital in Paris. Sarah Bartman died in December 1815 at the age of around 26. The cause of death remains uncertain. Some reports mention pneumonia, others suggest smallpox or general physical exhaustion. Whatever the cause, it was clear that her death was hastened by years of neglect, exploitation, and isolation. When she died, Sara was alone, without wealth, protection, or dignity. A French lawyer involved in her affairs noted that she passed away penniless, yet even in death, Sara was denied rest. Her body, instead of being buried, was claimed by French scientists who had waited for the opportunity to study her remains. Georges Cuvier, one of the most prominent anatomists in France at the time, oversaw the dissection of her body at the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. Cuvier and his colleagues examined her brain, skeleton, and genitals in an effort to prove racial hierarchy. They created plaster casts of her body and placed them on display alongside her preserved skeleton and organs. For more than a century, these grotesque displays remained in the museum, drawing attention from scientists, students, and tourists. Sara's image became fixed in the European imagination as both scientific specimen and colonial curiosity. Her life was reduced to a set of measurements, sketches, and anatomical models. This post-mortem treatment reveals the full extent of the objectification she endured. Even in death, she was not treated as a woman who had lived a difficult life and suffered under colonial cruelty. Instead, she was used to perpetuate the same ideas that had justified her exploitation in life. What happened to Sarah Bartman in Paris illustrates how racism, science, and popular entertainment collided to turn a human being into a tool. Her final days were spent in pain, stripped of dignity, surrounded by people who refused to see her as anything other than a body to be used. Her story did not end with her death. It continued in laboratories and museums that prolonged her dehumanization under the veil of research and discovery. Sarah's ordeal in Paris was the culmination of years of exploitation that began with the theft of her childhood and ended with the theft of her remains. Sarah Bartman died in Paris in December 1815. She was about 26 years old, sick and exhausted after years of public exhibition and abuse. Her death did not bring peace. Within hours, her body passed from the hands of one exploitative system to another. Instead of receiving a burial or a respectful end, she became the subject of further objectification. The French scientific community, especially anatomists interested in race classification, seized her corpse. The most prominent among them was Georges Cuvier, a figure whose influence on biological science still lingers today. Cuvier obtained Sarah's remains under the justification of academic research. At the time, there were no legal or ethical safeguards to prevent the use of human bodies without consent. Sara had no relatives present to speak for her. The French authorities handed over her corpse without resistance. Cuvier led the dissection himself. His interest was not in understanding how she died, but in examining her physical features to fit theories he already believed. He carefully measured her bones, studied her skull dimensions, and focused intently on her genitals and brain. He claimed he was collecting scientific data, but the motivation was to categorize her body within a hierarchy that placed African people at the bottom. Cuvier preserved parts of Sarah's body. Her skeleton, brain, and genitalia were kept intact. He also created a full-body plaster cast of her naked figure. These items were stored and later displayed at the newly formed Musée de l'Homme, or Museum of Man, in Paris. For decades, the museum positioned her body parts and cast as part of its racial exhibits. She was presented not as a human being, but as a biological specimen meant to represent a group of people. French schoolchildren, scholars, and tourists visited her display as part of of lessons on human difference. She was turned into an object of study and a public attraction even in death. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, her remains served as a reference point for scientific racism. Cuvier and his contemporaries used her physical features as evidence for theories of human stratification. They claimed that different races had distinct intellectual and moral capacities. According to these theories, people of European descent were considered the most advanced. People of African origin, especially women like Sara, were categorized as primitive. Her body became central to arguments that supported colonial domination, racial segregation, and social inequality. These ideas were not fringe. They were accepted across universities, scientific societies, and political institutions in France and beyond. Even the terms used to describe Sara's remains reflected the lack of regard for her humanity. Scientists cataloged her genitalia as anatomical oddities. Her steatopegia, a trait common among Khoikhoi women, was interpreted not as normal variation but as deviation. Instead of asking how her culture understood her body, French researchers insisted on judging it against European standards. They took measurements, photographs, and notes to support conclusions that had already been reached before the dissection even began. Her personhood had been erased, replaced by labels and numbers. In the early 20th century, a few French intellectuals began questioning the ethics of displaying Sara's body. One of them was Alfred Binet, who is often remembered for developing the first IQ test. Binet criticized the museum's use of her remains as racist spectacle. He pointed out that keeping her on display did not serve real science, but rather reinforced stereotypes. However, his objections did not lead to significant action. The exhibit continued through both world wars and remained a fixture in Parisian institutions well into the post-colonial era. During the 1970s, the political climate in France began to change. The civil rights movement in the United States, anti-colonial struggles in Africa, and global debates about human rights forced many museums and academic bodies to re-examine their practices. The Musée de l'Homme eventually removed Sara's skeleton from public display, but the plaster cast and preserved organs remained in storage. Her name was rarely mentioned, and her story faded from public memory in France. It was in South Africa that her memory found new life. During the final years of apartheid and into the country's transition to democracy, activists and scholars began using Sara's case as a symbol. Her treatment by Europeans mirrored the broader patterns of colonial domination, cultural theft, and racial hierarchy. After Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president, one of his early international acts was a formal request to France in 1994. He asked that Sarah Bartman's remains be returned to her homeland for proper burial. France initially refused. The legal argument rested on the classification of Sara's remains as scientific property. French law at the time made it difficult to remove items from national museums, especially human remains that had been incorporated into scientific collections. For years, South African diplomats, historians, and cultural leaders petitioned for her return. Their efforts gained momentum as awareness grew around the world about the unethical legacy of colonial-era science. Public pressure began to mount. France eventually passed a special bill to authorize the release of her remains. In 2002, nearly 2 centuries after her death, Sarah Bartman was flown back to South Africa. Her remains were accompanied by officials, cultural workers, and members of the Khoisan community. The ceremony held in her honor included traditional rituals and a state funeral. Her coffin, draped in the South African flag, was buried on a hillside near her birthplace in the Eastern Cape. For the first time, Sara was treated not as a curiosity or object, but as a daughter of the land who had endured too much. Sarah Bartman's return to South Africa in 2002 marked a moment of historical weight. The homecoming was not just ceremonial, it was a reckoning. When her coffin landed in Cape Town that March, state officials and cultural leaders were present. The plane's arrival was covered on national television. The casket, draped in the South African flag, descended onto tarmac, lined with silent witnesses. Khoikhoi elders stood in traditional dress. Nearby, children watched from schoolyards, holding flowers. This was not a mere funeral, it was a national moment of recognition. A life once ridiculed on foreign stages was now greeted with honor. Her burial was scheduled deliberately. On the 9th of August 2002, South Africa observed Women's Day, and on that day, Sarah Bartman was interred near her birthplace in Hankey. The town lies in the Eastern Cape, not far from the Gamtoos River. There, on a quiet hill, Khoikhoi leaders oversaw the rites. The procession moved slowly through the crowd. Men from local clans carried her coffin on their shoulders. Women gathered around the gravesite and began to sing. The songs were not mournful, but affirming. They invoked the ancestors. They acknowledged Sarah's long absence. Her return was not framed as a loss, but as a reunion. After nearly 2 centuries, the land she once walked welcomed her back. The site of her burial has since become a place of reflection. Visitors come to Hankey to pay their respects. Some bring offerings, others come to learn. The South African government supported the creation of a memorial space there. Markers were installed to teach the public about who Sarah was, what she endured, and why her story matters. The memorial is not grand in size, but it carries symbolic weight. For the Khoikhoi, whose culture had long been pushed to the margins, it represents a public acknowledgement that one of their own now holds a rightful place in the nation's story. In the decades that followed, Sarah Bartman's image and legacy became powerful symbols. Her name was no longer associated with spectacle. It became linked to resistance, dignity, and memory. In Cape Town, a major shelter for survivors of abuse was named the Saartjie Baartman Center for Women and Children. The choice was intentional. It drew a direct line between Sarah's experience of objectification and the ongoing challenges many South African women face today. The center does not merely serve clients, it also educates. The building itself contains murals, texts, and artworks that invoke Sarah's life and the broader fight for justice. International recognition also grew. UNESCO's Memory of the World Project in 2023 added the Saartjie Baartman Memorial to its list of sites for global remembrance. The listing did not just highlight Sarah's individual suffering, it emphasized the broader context: colonial science, racial abuse, and gendered violence. Museums in Europe began to revise their exhibits. Some added placards acknowledging the exploitation tied to 19th-century human displays. Others removed outdated content that had celebrated anatomical collections without questioning their origins. In Paris, scholars began organizing conferences and lectures specifically addressing how institutions had treated African remains in the past. In classrooms and academic circles, Sarah Bartman's story became a standard reference for conversations about historical exploitation. Her life appeared in university syllabi, literature, and public talks. Students were introduced to her not as a footnote, but as a case study in the ethics of science, the legacy of empire, and the misuses of gendered imagery. Her name entered poetry, film, and music. Creators responded to her story not with pity, but with defiance. They portrayed her not as a victim alone, but as a mirror reflecting the society that mistreated her. The act of repatriation itself became a turning point. When South Africa negotiated for Sarah's return, it did so not just to recover human remains. It demanded recognition. France's initial resistance had rested on legal technicalities. Her body was classified as scientific property. The debate that followed exposed deeper tensions between old colonial powers and formerly colonized nations. South Africa's persistence sent a message: the right to memory and dignity does not expire. No museum label or academic claim could override that principle. When France finally agreed to send her home, it acknowledged that the ownership of a person's body cannot belong to institutions that once dehumanized her. This return had broader implications. It spurred other countries to question the contents of their museums. It led to public pressure campaigns demanding the return of African skulls, sacred objects, and ceremonial items held in European collections. Sarah's case did not resolve these issues, but it illuminated them. Her reburial became a model for how to engage respectfully with the past. It combined legal advocacy, public education, and spiritual rituals to restore what had been stolen. Today, Sarah Bartman's memory stands as a symbol with multiple meanings. For some, she represents the resilience of indigenous communities who refuse to let history be written solely by conquerors. For others, she is a cautionary figure, reminding modern society of how easily scientific ambition can become complicit in dehumanization. She also remains a feminist icon. Her story brings attention to how Black women's bodies have been viewed, used, and silenced across time. It shows how forms of objectification can mutate but still persist, from 19th century exhibits to present-day media portrayals. The echoes of her life can still be heard in modern struggles. Advocates for racial justice and women's rights often invoke her name. They use it not only to remember a person, but to highlight an enduring structure. Before you go, if this story moved you or helped you see the past more clearly, please consider subscribing, liking the video, and tapping the bell. It's a simple way to support this channel and make sure more voices like Sarah Bartman's are never forgotten.